Welcome to The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky, a weekly podcast that breaks down politics, policy, and current affairs. I'm Becky Scherr.
And I'm Michael Brodkorb.
After a week off, we are back with a jam-packed episode. We are going to start by breaking down last week's State of the Union address. We will get into key messaging points, some surrounding drama, what we thought of the event, and the tone and the reception. Second, we will get into the big news of this week, the oversight hearing on Capitol Hill where Governor Walz and Attorney General Ellison are testifying, as well as breaking down the new report the committee released. Then we will get into a discussion about Republicans and abortion, focused on a recent Star Tribune article titled, Minnesota Republicans are recalibrating on abortion after past election losses. We will break down our thoughts on candidates' messaging, what it means for actual policy, and how voters will respond from endorsement to general. We will then move into a breakdown of Congresswoman Angie Craig's op-ed claiming regret from voting in favor of the Laken Riley Act, something she has been hit on by her opponent, Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan. We will end by acknowledging the new conflict in Iran and the tragic death of a Minnesotan, and we will fully get into a conversation about this more next week. Thank you for joining us and enjoy the show. So, Michael, we're officially, Olympics have come and gone, United States all the way. You're repping our country today.
Yeah, so we were off last week, a well-deserved break because you particularly have been crushing it. And I've just been the backup band, kind of like the ham of the podcast, now that I think about it. Just the backup act. No, I am, Olympics, yes. I'm a big Olympics person. Watching them. Do you watch the Olympics? Did you watch the Olympics?
I did. It's a little hard, I feel like, to watch any show or game or match or anything with children as young as mine because, work day and then they come home and it's like we got an hour and a half before the baby goes to bed that we got to do playtime and dinner time and bath time and all the things. And then immediately after he goes down, the toddler. So it's like 5 to 8 is pretty much like kid zone. So it's a little tough. But the good thing about the Olympics being overseas is, you get to have it on during the workday and watch some crazy stuff to go down.
Yes, I did watch the Olympics. I'm a big fan of the Olympics. So yes, we weren't on last week, or I would have celebrated the gold medal victories by the women's and men's hockey team by wearing my Olympic garb. But I'm still repping it right now. Yes, big fan of the Olympics. I hope to go in Los Angeles to the Olympics, not as an athlete, just to be clear, not as an athlete, but as a participant. I love the Olympics. I love watching it.
Not as an athlete, but as a participant.
I'm sorry, as a guest, not as I'm sorry, as someone in the crowd. Yes, unless they make a over 50 old man Olympics.
Have you seen the folks that pitch? I see it every Olympics that pitch that we need to have a normal person competing in these aside, a lane in the swimming or running or,
Yep.
Some of these things just to see. I mean, we know these people excel. But when they're all so good, it's hard to judge just truly how incredible their skill and expertise is. Let's have like 50-year-old or 40-year-old men and women doing these, long distance runs or doing a throwing and strategy in a curling match. I mean, I would love nothing more.
I think it would be great. I think I could do good in luge because you just lay there. And I've been talking to Jeff Kolb about maybe doing 2-man luge.
Hey,
I'd be the
there
bottom.
you go.
I'd be the bottom. And so, no, I like the Olympics. And so I love patriotic themed attire. Now, if I can just make a little statement here, editorial aside for a second. One of the things about MAGA, I'm just going to say it. I think they brought a lot of kitschy Americana garb into fashion. And so what's nice about having some Olympic pride is they're coming out with a lot of classic good stuff again. And so I love the Olympics. I love watching it. Congratulations to all the athletes. And particularly, I'm a big fan of watching hockey, both men's and women's hockey. Gold medal. Congratulations. Love the Olympics. Cannot wait for 2028 for the Olympics to come back.
A few other fun facts along that line. Minnesota, correct me if I'm wrong, but my last thing, Minnesota had the most medal count of athletes at the Olympics this time around, which is incredible. I think usually winter is more a Minnesota Olympic speed thing. I'm a big fan of that. And then some of my favorites are watching some of the celebrities that go over and participate. Colin Jost from SNL, I think did a luge or bobsled and was just His post interview after that was just hilarious. Flava Flav did the skeleton. And I mean, who would have thought that if you told us 20 years ago that Snoop Dogg and Flava Flav are two of the folks that are like, the United States is wrapping our arms around them as representing us and being commentary at the Olympics. Just their interviews are hilarious. He did the skeleton, went over 60 miles an hour. Just insane. And it's so fun.
No, it's great. It's absolutely great. You are, knowing those stats, once again, you're Wikipedia. You're like a human version of Wikipedia.
I
I
just,
got to ask you.
I screenshot stuff.
That's fantastic. One quick aside I want to ask you about this, and I don't want to politicize the Olympics too much, but we do break down politics on the show. What's your take on athletes speaking up about their views on things?
You know, one of the great things about being in the United States is we are one of the freest countries in the world. I personally, I mean, we've talked a little bit about, I think, over the years of like celebrities and doing stuff. If you have a platform, I think if you've earned your platform, if you're the best in something, if you're famous for something, you have the right to do that with that, whatever you may. I think the Olympics tends to be something where we're supposed to have some sort of unifying front and you're proud representing the state or the country that you are there representing. So I do think it's kind of like one of those things that like maybe should be tempered a little bit. And again, I think it's you, if you want to potentially risk or put a target on your back for people to dislike you because of what you say, whether that's you saying, I hate the color purple, or I hate pizza, or I dislike Donald Trump or like him, that's your prerogative. I think the Olympics tends to be a place where, you know, we want to have a little bit more unity. We like to, you know, wrap ourselves in the Olympic or the American flag and have that pride. But again, you know, who am I to say that you using your platform and you know, utilizing the free speech that the Constitution of the great states of the United States of America allows you can't be allowed? I mean, I think putting any limits on that is just the antithesis of who we are as a nation.
That
Your
was really
thoughts?
good. I don't know what you've been drinking in the morning, but you've been coming on these podcast shows, and I mean that healthily. I know the way that sounds. I'm not saying you're bending the elbow but it's whatever it is. You've been crying. That's a really good way to describe it, and I agree. I would probably, when I appear in the Olympics at some point, I'll just be happy to be there. But I don't fault. I mean, there's a pretty long history of people using their opportunities at the Olympics to show their opinion on a variety of social justice issues. And so I watch it for the sport. I don't watch it for the commentary and things. It's kind of like how I watch the Academy Awards. I watch it to see the glitz and the glamour, things that I'm
Mhm.
not all about. And so watching this, but I don't fault people. I just wanted to get your take on it. And
Yeah.
I think
I
you're
mean,
got a pretty sensible take
and
on this. On
I also
this.
think that there is, you know, a history of countries and nations going to the Olympics of putting all of that aside as well, right? I mean, that obviously we have a history of athletes being kidnapped or different wild things that have happened. So there is obviously a risk of even being affiliated with any nation. But it is something, I mean, it gives me goosebumps to think of all of these nations and all of their different conflicts and issues with their leaders and different things that are going on within politics and religious in these countries, that they come together for the pride and the history of what our world is and what we seek to hopefully, you know, have it be once again of being able to compete and link arms and lift each other up. And I think it's a pretty wonderful thing.
You're exactly right. My final take, which is going to be controversial, my final take on the Olympics is that it is a waste for these countries to always build these complexes. There should be fixed locations where the Olympics rotate through. And number two, the games should always be broadcast. And this is going to be really a tough take. They should always be broadcast on prime time for the United States.
Agreed.
And I know our listeners in all these other continents and all these other parts of the world are going to be upset. But if someone's got to skate in Milano at 2 o'clock in the morning so I can watch it from the comfy confines of my living room live, that's the way it should be.
All right.
Because we're America. All
I
right.
love it. America. Speaking of America, getting into a big topic of last week that we obviously did not cover because we did not chat last week was the State of the Union address was last week. President Trump's second for his second term, technically second. The first one was the inauguration. This was the State of the Union. It was the longest State of the Union address in history at 1 hour and 47 minutes. Trump now holds 5 of the top 10 longest State of the Union addresses. Bill Clinton has 4 and Joe Biden has 1. Just a couple fun facts, stats here. The pool of viewers on this skewed Republican, 13% more Republicans than the general public tune in, and viewership was largely down. 4 million less watched it in 2026 than in 2025, and those viewers skew older. I don't think that's super shocking. I don't think I think it's Republicans tuning in to see what they want to see, and some Democrats tuning in to see what they want to be enraged about the next day, and maybe some in the middle tuning in to watch the great tradition of a president, whether you like him or dislike him, give a State of the Union address.
Yep, I would agree.
I always love to see the guests of the delegation. We have Emmer brought the Blaine police chief. Finstead also brought a police chief from his district. We had Morrison and McCullum brought Hortman's son Colin and his wife. Pete Stauber brought Nick Shirley and David from the infamous Nick Shirley YouTube fraud videos. Representative Omar brought 4 people who she said reflect how ICE's reckless actions in Minnesota through Operation Metro Serve have devastated Minnesota's safety and economic security. And Klobuchar brought a small business owner impacted by tariffs.
When you worked for Congressman Emmer, that's like big night. Have you ever attended a State of the Union or?
No, I always was back in the office.
Details.
Yeah, back in the office doing rapid response was always a thing we did. So we, get the State of the Union address ahead of time and put together some tweets and fact checks and different things that were important to Emmer or his district that we would either counter or promote. So I was there for 2 years under Obama and 1 year under Trump. And so there was definitely some different strategies of what we were doing and what we were saying, but I loved it. We sat there, we watched it. And then I also went over and would meet him usually afterwards, take photos of him and his guests. It was a big, wild, you're at the Capitol or across the street at the office until 1 a.m. It's exciting. It's something I will never forget, even for those that were not necessarily ones I loved the content or policy of Barack Obama, but how cool to be able to say that I was across the street when it was going on.
That's great. For political nerds like us, that's a real nerd fest. And it's historic too. Man, that's just great. It's fantastic.
We had, I want to talk a little bit. So overall tone started with some of his successes, talked about, unity, pro-America stuff, ended with some of the contrast from the Democrats. And, I always like Frank Luntz, pollster focus groups is one that I always like to kind of watch what he's saying about it. During that, he said that this ended up being one of the most controversial State of the Unions he had seen, and said that more to the faithful than to the persuadable middle voter. And I would tend to agree on that. One thing that I always love to watch is kind of the, again, optics and drama surrounding it. It was kind of reflective, I feel like, of the Super Bowl halftime show, secondary one. The Democrats put together their secondary People's State of the Union that was offsite. Senator Tina Smith from Minnesota did not attend the State of the Union joint address in the Capitol. She went to the People's State of the Union. DNC Chair Ken Martin was there. Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey was out doing a speech at one of these events as well. So that's always a fun thing. But then so empty seats is an optics. This is something for me, again, this is about the historic nature of it. You show up and sit there and you can frown and you can scowl and you can refuse to stand up. Empty chairs makes it feel like you're not doing your job, in my perspective. What's your thought on Democrats just not showing up?
I would absolutely agree. I think at some point, this kind of partisan merry-go-round has to stop. And I know it's both sides. I don't care who started it, but I would love to see every seat filled, aside from the designated survivor. I'd like every seat filled.
Agreed.
And so I don't like it. You show up. It doesn't mean you sit there silently. That doesn't mean that you don't offer some retort, but be there. Be there. I mean, treat it like a freshman pep rally. Just be there. Just be there and be engaged.
Well, one that was certainly engaged was Representative Al Green, who was kicked out of his second event by or speech by Trump. So that was one thing. But we had the Democrats, doing their "we're not going to stand, we're not going to clap." We talked about this, I think, last year or previous speeches. I think last year they didn't stand for honoring some.
The kid that was the Secret Service agent.
Yes.
Remember that?
Yes. Wild. This one, I think, was a little bit of a misstep. I don't know what I expected them to do. I think it was something that the Trump campaign capitalized on. And man, polling must be showing that this is something that they really are going to move on. And I can see this being midterm ads are already being cut. Stand if you agree. The first duty of the American government is to protect American citizens, not illegal aliens. Democrats did not stand. Now, I don't love the raise your hands, step up, honk your horn sort of thing, but it was visual.
I would struggle with what I would do. I may stand, I may not. I can see it from both sides. There's a part of it where, again, here's the thing. And I think one of the things we talk a lot about is politics is theater. It's very rarely is it it's all orchestrated. There's a bit of theater to it. It's all choreographed, maybe is a better way in which to say it. And so this was all choreographed. And so you have a choice when the game is being played, when that theater is being portrayed right in front of you. Do you participate or do you not? And I can see it from both sides. There's a part of me where I think just stand. But on the other side, I'm like, yeah, members of Congress have a different role in that situation. And obviously the members of the cabinet that are there, the Supreme Court that's there, they just kind of stay. Yeah. Sometimes the cabinet members will stand in support of some things. But generally, that is a report to Congress. And so I don't know. I can see, I figured you were going to ask about this because you're great with your scripts and you know how to just dive into this. I don't know what I would do. I can see it both ways.
For me, even though we've had lots of conversations about, our thoughts on folks coming to the country, being here illegally, should they be deported, all of that sort of thing. I think that this one's tough for me because I think the American government, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence is for the people, by the people. And so to me, that screams American citizens. And I'm not saying a Democrats standing up for this would also be eviscerated. So it's a lose-lose situation. I do expect that we'll see this in a number of ads though.
Yes, I would agree with you.
Democrats refused to stand up for voter ID laws, lowest murder rate since 1900, keeping violent criminals locked up. List goes on and on. Nothing I don't think as compelling as what we debated last time. I think we had maybe Julius and John on. But that's where we went. Top issues: immigration, economy, affordability. I think a winning one, he talked about in 4 long years, the last administration got less than $1 trillion in new investment in the United States. In 12 months, I secured commitments for over $18 trillion pouring in from all over the globe. That I think is a good success to swing. He officially announcing the war on fraud to be led by our great Vice President, J.D. Vance. That was, notable for Minnesota. And then I saw a decent amount of backlash that he kind of mocked the word affordability, which is something that I think was a Trumpism that his staff was probably just cringing at as well. When polling viewers of this, 31% of watchers expressed a lot of confidence in the president to make the cost of living more affordable. 29% said they had some confidence, but 40% said they had none at all. And I think this is something that Trump and Republicans are going to need to focus on ahead of the 2026 midterms.
I would agree. I would absolutely agree with your take.
One of my favorite things, George Washington's gavel was on the rostrum, was on the podium up there. Speaker Mike Johnson displayed it for the first time. It is the 250th anniversary this year. I think it's really incredible. It's beautiful, and it was used in a 1793 ceremony to lay the U.S. Capitol cornerstone. How cool. Again, goosebumps. Just amazing. And then we loved the gold medal winning men's Olympic team came in. They weren't sitting in there. They came in as part of the speech. That was a very bipartisan standing clap. Incredible moment. Yeah, that was exciting.
Yes.
And we don't I don't think have time to get into it today, maybe another day, about kind of the backlash that came over the men's team versus the women's team and the locker room call, and I have all sorts of thoughts about that, but maybe we hold that for another day.
Yeah, let's do that next week because I have some thoughts on that too.
And then a big, total unnecessary Somali pirates who ransacked Minnesota. Ugh.
Again, the theme that I'm kind of rolling my eyes at is this partisanship, this hyper partisan merry-go-round is what I'm going to start talking about more. I just wish we would get off this. And I get it. If you're keeping score at home, someone started this, but at some point, I'm just looking for leaders on both sides to just come in and do the right thing. And again, I don't think Donald Trump is a good person. I want him to succeed, as I want all presidents to succeed, to the degree at which it helps the interests of the United States of America. I just wish he wouldn't. Everything is bastardized right now in terms of politics. And the State of the Union, there's been some jabs over the years, but going down to Somali pirates who ransacked Minnesota, this is the problem with the president, particularly for Republicans in Minnesota. This type of rhetoric, it's not helpful. It's not appropriate. It's not, first of all, it's not appropriate. And wearing my partisan hat, it's not helpful to Republicans. And so I want to be clear that it's not helpful. It's not appropriate to all Minnesotans. But putting on my partisan hat, this is the type of stuff that it would be beneficial to Republicans if he just stopped.
Absolutely concur. We then just want to note two rebuttals responses. We had, like I mentioned, Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey was out in Washington, D.C. He did a speech a little bit away at a different State of the Swamp counter event, and really hit home that the State of the Union isn't what happens under the Capitol Dome. It's what happens in neighborhoods in cities like Minneapolis. He claimed political retaliation of what's going on, that they try to punish an entire city for its politics, and then lifted up Minneapolis as a community resisting fear. He had three pillars that are kind of, I'll talk a little bit more in the rebuttal from the official Democrat rebuttal, but his three pillars were kind of federal overreach, civil liberties and due process, and cities as the front line of democracy. When we look at that, so I'll come back to my thought real quick. The official rebuttal was from Virginia Governor Abigail Spanberger. She is a former CIA officer, more of a centrist House Democrat, or former centrist House Democrat, newly elected governor. And they definitely, I think, I look at this and I would say, this was brilliant for Democrats heading into a midterm. It was middle of the road. It was not bombastic. It focused on, we're the stability, we're the adults in the room. We are going to be focusing on the real issues that are mattering to Minnesotans or to Americans. And man, if you look at those three themes from Jacob Frey's and the themes from this, if you just read this from what I have here in the show prep, it screams Republican. I mean, it screams old school Romney McCain to me, of like just what Republicans used to argue, right? Her key themes are focusing on families, not political fights. Talking about how, while Trump and Republicans are focusing on all this drama in Washington, Americans are focusing on the cost of living and healthcare and childcare and retirement security. She talked about the economic anxiety a little bit more, the middle class economic pressure, rising grocery prices, housing affordability, prescription drug costs, again, childcare costs. There is obviously a theme. And then ended with democracy and rule of law. Talked about protecting Democrat institutions, the importance of checks and balances, hello Supreme Court and tariffs, defending free and fair elections. And I think that some of these things are what we're seeing a new Democrats have had a lot of messaging issues over the last few years. I think
Correct.
they've focused on the far left. They focused on the bombastic issues. They focused on the things that, yes, people care about, but what people care about is what's occurring in their homes and their works and their paychecks right now. And this, it was really good. I thought she did a really good job. I think that Choice was a really good job. It was less about focusing on just anti-Trump and more focusing on what Democrats hope to think and say. Now, there wasn't a lot of specifics in it. It was more in generalities. But I thought it hit the marks if you're looking at a counter to what President Trump did at the Capitol.
I think you nailed the script again. There was the longest State of the Union in American history, plus the dual kind of responses. And I think you really dialed in on it. I was in Arizona recently, and Arizona, home of the late, great United States Senator and constitutional leader in the Republican Party, Barry Goldwater. And I did some travels around Arizona and made a pilgrimage to the Barry Goldwater Memorial. And I've read a number of books from Barry Goldwater, Conscious of a Conservative, Conscious of the Majority, and I'm diving into a new book about him right now. And I've printed off all of the speeches, and the one that if I was laying without a name in front of them, the one that sounds the least Republican is Trump's. And the one that has some of those themes that the Republican Party used to believe so strongly in is Fry's. And I just got to say, love to have him on the podcast at some point. Don't know if we can get that, but his stock is really rising nationally. And I thought Governor Spanberger's speech was great. I didn't see the start of Trump's speech. I was at a hockey game, got home. It was super long. So I got to see a bulk of it, but then watched the responses and nerded out in the post-analysis coverage. I thought the Democrats did what they needed to do in terms of a response. And to the degree at which Democrats are talking about due process and civil liberties, that is going to appeal to a lot of independents.
Mind-boggling. It is literally
particularly when the Secretary of Homeland Security is in front of a congressional hearings yesterday. It is not ruling out the fact that DHS and other people will be at polls on election day. I don't want to play the conspiracy theories about what's going to happen this election, but it's insightful that she didn't rule that out. And it's not something that we're planning, but didn't rule. And so when you see the Democrats start to weave in subject areas where they have traditionally not gotten into, that's the opportunity that Republicans have right now, or the Democrats have, because of what Republican missteps have been. And so I think that from a substance standpoint, I think their speech was much more substantive. But again, who's really watching it?
And that's what it is. And also, can they keep that sort of discipline up for 9 months, right?
Yeah.
Like, when you are very scripted and very measured and really have been, she had that probably calls from the DNC and the DGA and, the DCCC and all of these different Democratic groups saying, this is what we need. This is what we're seeing in the polls. This is what you must deliver. And she did that. That's a lot different than hundreds of congressional candidates and Senate candidates and governor candidates and all of these other Democrats around the country moving forward and what they're going to say and do. And while this was impressive, I'm not overly optimistic that they're not going to be able to take the bait that Trump is going to be dangling in front of them to continue to make it about what Donald Trump is and what he does. They know that's their misstep, is focusing too much on Trump, but there's also some wins in that, and I just don't see that they will be able to avoid that. So, but bravo. If you would have told me a Democrat in 2026 is focusing on economics and kitchen table issues and due process in the Constitution, I would have been like, okay, yeah, right. So it was just nice as a Republican to see. And if I think that and others watch that, I mean, that is a little troublesome. So,
yep.
Moving on to more theater in Washington, D.C. We are recording this whatever word we use these days, a little bit early because I get to go on a fantastic vacation to somewhere warm here. But as we're taping this, fraud hearing in Washington, D.C., we have Governor Tim Walz, Attorney General Keith Ellison are out before the U.S. House Oversight Committee hearing. And so let's chat a little bit. Obviously, we're not going to know everything that comes out of that because, again, we're recording this while it's going on. But starting with, while they're sitting there in front of the hearing, in front of the members, the Oversight Committee unleashed a bombshell report. The cost of doing nothing, how Tim Walz and Keith Ellison fueled Minnesota's fraud explosion. Yeah, obviously it's a 54-page report. I did not read the entire thing, but some interesting...
Why not, Becky?
Ain't nobody got time for that. We have some key findings that they, put out that I did through some of my research, what I'm seeing online from folks who did read it, is basically alleging that Ellison and Walz were aware for years ahead of time about this fraud. They deliberately misled the American people about their knowledge of the fraud. They possessed clear authority to safeguard taxpayer dollars and repeatedly failed to take meaningful action. They talk about how that they were aware of this back in 2019 and in 2020. They talked about issues with the whistleblowers, which we've heard a little bit about, auditors flagging some problems, which we've highlighted some of those that have come out, and lawmakers claim that those warnings were not acted on. It also goes into that the state agencies had the ability to withhold funding or suspend funding. They claim the court said that they had to keep it going, that apparently based on, again, I'm saying allegedly based on this report because I just haven't seen know enough to be able to stand on either side of this. But what they're saying is the courts actually did not force that to go through, and they chose to do so. There was some testimony that there was findings. Again, this is a dozen or 24 former and current state employees. Some say that they let Walz's former chief of staff know some of this, and they have some evidence of that. Walz is claiming that he was not made aware, and so it's kind of, they definitely tried to get him on. Then do you fault your chief of staff? Do you fault your agency heads? Like, who knew what? When did they know it? And was it, again, I think what we've been arguing or discussing is, was this negligence? Was this intent? Was there intent behind it to allow this to go through? Were they just not doing their jobs? Like, what? Again, this is what we've been trying to argue for the last year or so, but it's troublesome. It certainly is troublesome, and I think it kind of just tries to wrap up a lot of what we know in a nice little bow in this report, and I'm certainly excited to dive in and have folks way smarter than me dive in and tell us a little bit more.
Well, I'm hoping that smart folks like you dive in and tell me what to think. But honestly, first of all, Walz and Ellison both went.
Yes.
Which is
you were
something
right.
that we discussed. I'm glad they went. I think they have the responsibility to win. I want to be consistent, just like not showing up to the State of the Union. Look, this is all theater. We know that this is theater, and not to say that good things can't come out of political theater, because they have. But this is, I don't know how productive this hearing will be, but it's another example and another report that has come out. And here's my just take without having, examined the report fully, is that fraud is not going away. Fraud is not going away. And I think the challenge for Republicans right now is the number is so big, it's so massive. Does anyone really have their arms fully around it? And so what the public, and push back if you think I'm wrong, but the public sees another congressional hearing, the governor's there, the attorney general's there, and there's this bickering that's going on about fraud. Democrats and Republicans, to a degree, going at it. No one's really pro-fraud, aside from the people that had committed the fraud. But the question that I have is this number getting so big? Is the problem of fraud so massive that it's becoming difficult for anyone to fully wrap their arms around? Joe Thompson was someone who I thought when he went to the microphone and spoke on this issue, he did a really good job of bringing it down. And let me say this way. I'm going to start over. What I think Republicans should be concerned about is that the fraud problem is becoming messaged in such a massive way. They're including so much information that it's going to be overwhelming for people to comprehend and understand how bad it truly was, because we're learning things as we're going along. And this new report comes out. So here's another report about fraud. There's not a definitive repository. There's not one person who's produced kind of the one report or the one person that's on this. And the Republicans, I think, have lost, a quality messenger on fraud in Joe Thompson. So I wonder sometimes is if the public sees this, they know fraud is bad. They know that it shouldn't have happened. But when we get into all these examples, is it become too much for people to understand how massive it is, to understand how big 9 billion is? I mean, I know what the number is, but we're now talking potentially up to 9 billion. I wonder if Republicans are getting lost in the minutia of the fraud, and they're not presenting, I think, a clear path to how we get out of this, other than just saying you got to throw everyone out. Because the Democrats' retort is, this is a problem with both sides. Even though there's one that's in charge, we can play that game. But I don't know right now that there is someone who's filled that void of Joe Thompson. I don't know if someone has stepped into that lane and to say, and that the public says from both sides, this is someone who can credibly, first of all, explain to us what the problem is, and then present a plan how to get out of it. Because another 54-page report really doesn't help really get to the bottom of it. Do you understand? I'm trying to, like, what I'm trying to say, like, the problem is becoming so big, and no one, I think, is getting ahead of the messaging on it, that I think it's going to become difficult for people to grasp. Here's the size and scope of the problem. Here's who to blame. And I think that the size of this is kind of like the blob. It's consuming everything else. And I think Republicans are losing a little bit of control of this message.
I agree. I think, 9 billion is just so hard. I mean, not that I can vision $250 million, but, we had the 250 or so in Feeding Our Future. And then we had another, 54 million in some Medicaid. And then we have, as you look at these different ones, I feel like you can kind of see it. And now it just becomes, are we tuning it out? Are we tuning it out because every day there's a new one, which they should continue to uncover fraud. I'm not by any means saying, well, stop finding new fraud. We got to focus on what's in front of us. And at some point, I mean, I think we've been consistent on the fact that, to me, at this point, I don't know that, other than potential criminal proceedings, I don't know that intent within the administration at whatever level, whether that's staff, commissioners, the administration, Governor Walz, whether intent even matters. There were people that knew things and did nothing about it. And that's what, so we need to let the people uncover and go against those that need to be held accountable and do what they need to do. What I want the legislature to do is to stop the bleeding, stop it from happening tomorrow. We need to have people get money. Autism centers need money, adult daycares need money, caregivers need money. We can't just stop. I mean, there has to be some level of that, but you need to figure out how to make sure that this is not happening. And obviously there are site visits that need to happen. We need to have folks that are going through these things minute by minute, line item by line item, and finding the places in Wilmer where more kids are being fed than exist in the entire city. You need to find these places where, there are obviously folks that are working 22, 23 out, working, quote unquote, working and filing claims for 23 hours a day, which obviously is not possible. There are some things that we need to focus on the big picture for sure. But I also feel like we need to focus on the little picture and figure out those safeguards and those little things, like a new form that has like automatic back-end checks. Like when I buy Sudafed from Target and I go online and I have to enter, different things, and they have to scan my ID for me to get, some sort of medication delivered. How is there not back-end computer databases work that can do this work, that can do some checks and balances and flag something that says, hey, this person put in filings claiming that they did 23 hours of appointments yesterday. That can't happen. Let's, again, simplifying it, but I agree with you. I think we're getting lost here. I think that the folks need to continue to prosecute and figure it out and turn over the money. But they are services, and this is what Walz, we're hearing him say on the Hill today, right? Like, we do good things for people. And I don't disagree with some of that good that we need to continue to do. But we need to figure out how to continue to do that and make sure we're not continuing to give thousands, millions of dollars to folks who are not using it properly.
Correct. I completely agree with you. I think I can say we've taken the position, Office of Inspector General, it should be something that should be accomplished. That's the one, when we did our kind of legislative preview, it's one of the issues that I talked about, and I think you did too. I hope that passes. I think that would be great. We obviously need that in this state. I just think we're collecting so much, and it's important to do that. But honestly, I'm again putting on kind of my Republican hat. I wonder if it's getting somewhat lost. I go back to when we had and I worked at the legislature, we had a new stadium, the US Bank Stadium. And Republicans were generally not supportive of there being a new stadium. Minnesotans did not want the Vikings to leave, but they weren't supportive. Republicans were generally not supportive of the funding structure for a new US Bank Stadium. And so the Governor Dayton at the time, was able to be both. He was able to come in and be somewhat of the problem solver. And I think honestly, when we get to fraud, my dad was a forensic accountant. He was a CPA. There is a need to run the ledger to see how big the problem is. But ultimately, this isn't just a tabulation process where the job of legislators and members of Congress is just not to add it up and make the number as big as it's possible. It's to present a solution to how it's going to get fixed. And it's what I keep going back to and discussing is that at some point, Republicans have to produce a plan, putting on my partisan hat, that says, how are they going to solve it? If that's the Office of Inspector General, great. But again, going to the voters and saying, this is how much we've tabulated and this is how big the number is, now put us in. I don't think that's the exact equation. I think what the voters are going to want to see is, give us the number. Thank you for identifying the size and scope of the problem, but what is your plan to solve it? And where I think Republicans need to be focused on, and where I think some of this is shifting away a bit, is how are you going to solve it? How are you going to solve this? And so I would certainly like to see the tabulation effort go on, but also I think more of a conscious shift to how do we solve this? How do we credibly address not just the size of it, but how do we get to solving it and make it function more? And that's where I think Republicans may be losing that argument a bit right now.
I agree. I hope then, we get that Inspector General moving forward, so we have one key place for this to be focused on. I thought that there was an interesting debate going on in the Minnesota House yesterday. Jim Nash has a bill about how Representative Jim Nash has a bill about how we should calculate some of the impact of fraud is going to have on future forecasts, which at this point, we know it's going to have some impact. I feel like to get an accurate picture, or, forecasts are still not as accurate, but, a guesstimate, an educated guess of where we're going to stand. I think that makes sense. So we're not spending money that, again, we do not have. I know Representative Niska had a good fraud bill this week as well. I know a lot's going on. I'm hopeful that, there can be some bipartisan work and we can get some stuff moving. But while this I think is important and there will be some good that comes out of it, I feel like it also just drives the partisan wedge in the middle of this issue even more. And so we'll see how it comes out. I do think, Walz seems to be prepared. How much, I think we'll probably get another, if you remember, we talked about the cost to taxpayers for the 2025 hearing prep was about $430,000. Chatted about that. It will be interesting to see what that is for this time with Walz and Ellison out there. You know, he certainly has some of his lines of, I'm not here to be a prop, and I don't have that number in front of me, trying not to take the bait a little bit. I don't love when I'm wearing my partisan hat. I don't love the smirk that I see on his face a decent amount of the time when he's responding. But it does seem like a little less back and forth shouting, a little bit more restrained from both sides, maybe a little bit.
Yeah.
And then
I mean,
Democrats are using this as an ICE hearing.
a little bit, yeah. So, I mean, it's all theater, and good things come from theater. I saw the debate, some of the debate with Representative Nash, where he was talking about that's the type of tabulation I think is responsible. It shows that we need to go. And I like that. I think this whole fraud discussion, I guess my kind of closing on this subject would be this fraud issue is something that you and I have said, great issue for Republicans to tackle. I think we need more specific solutions and messaging on those solutions, because that's where I think ultimately Republicans are going to do a good job with independents and folks that this is a top issue for. And it is a good issue for Republicans to bring up.
Agreed. In a short session, just a couple months to do anything here. So I'm sure we will be chatting about it often. Another thing that we've been chatting about often over the last couple of years is abortion and Republican stance and messaging on that. The Star Tribune had a piece earlier this week titled Minnesota Republicans are recalibrating on abortion after past election losses. So, you know, I think a great interview, if anybody wants to go back to the archives, is our first interview with former governor candidate Scott Jensen back right after the 2022, so it was early 2023, where he talked a lot about what he learned in messaging, in his stance on abortion and all of that. And, you know, I think this article was a very interesting insight into some of that. It talks about how after 2022 and the post-Dobbs backlash, some Minnesota Republicans are trying to change how they talk about abortion, even if they haven't changed the underlying policy goals. Quick note here too, Democrats in the Minnesota during the trifecta did pass legislation in 2023 that cemented abortion access in state law and cleared away legal restrictions on the procedure. But I think a little bit of this, and I want to chat a little bit more after we talk about the article about some recent Substacks that you did. But we kind of see a shift from the focusing on legislation and being all absolute to a little bit of persuasion and empathy, at least in terms of messaging. And I think this is something we can chat a little bit more of. We talk a lot about storytelling. You know, I think that I'm happy to go into the empathy and emotions of it a little bit here as we have this conversations. But abortion is something that I think for folks, especially, I guess on both sides, pro-choice, pro-life, it's a little bit sometimes hearts over mind. And I think speaking to the such is an important way to go through this. But I want to hear from you, because I've done a lot of talking about your thoughts and views of this article, anything that pointed out or stood out for you, and just as it pertains to our conversations over the years.
Well, I think it's important. When we started this podcast, one of the discussions that we had kind of in planning, and we've mentioned this before, was like we wanted to figure out what we could do more to help Republicans' message to the suburbs and talk about that kind of issue, and then also elevate the voices of female candidates, which we've done. The issue of abortion is one I think that we're pretty close on where we stand. And the party dogma on it is, I think, outside of where vast majority of Minnesotans are. And so I think this is an interesting article. I think I'd be curious how much of an actual debate is going to happen on abortion. I'm not aware of any effort that is being undertaken by any of the candidates to reframe the party platform, the party position on this. The national platform dropped most of their language on abortion in 2024, but the Minnesota party platform the Republican Party Minnesota platform is pretty strong on what they want for abortion and the language that they want. Minnesota has some unique court decisions regarding abortion. And so I think the challenge that's happening right now, particularly for some candidates, is that we have candidates running for office that are pro-choice. I'm not aware of any time that the Republican Party has ever knowingly endorsed a pro-choice candidate. It's something that I've said before on the podcast. I got active in the party in around 94, and I don't think the party's ever knowingly endorsed a pro-choice candidate. They did endorse Judy Dutcher in 94 and 98, and she was pro-choice. The reason why she was endorsed is they didn't ask about abortion. And she later left the Republican Party and joined the Democrats. But Judy Dutcher was endorsed I think she was in 98. She was endorsed. I think she might have been endorsed in 94 too. But that's the only time it's happened, and that's why I say knowingly endorsed, because candidates that usually get endorsed or seek the party's endorsement, not necessarily buy, but seek the party's endorsement, are pro-life, except for the kind of notable exceptions of rape, incest, and life of the mother. And so this type of discussion that's coming in, particularly when you have some candidates that I think are are truly pro-choice, it's going to be an interesting debate, because what I'm curious about is for those candidates that have that, because I would agree, I would consider myself to be someone who personally pro-life, but I would be described as pro-choice. And we've talked about it extensively, how Republican candidates talk about abortion. I think the party does need to take a more thoughtful and full-throated examination on where the platform is and what their expectation is of candidates seeking the endorsement. But that has to be done openly, transparently, and there will be some resistance to it. I will say, before I get into a little bit of the Substack posts, a couple kind of hard rules that I have in politics: don't tell seniors not to worry about Social Security, don't tell advocates of the Second Amendment to not worry about their guns, and don't tell either side of people on abortion that their position is stupid. And so that's not the way to frame it. And I think there's going to be challenges. I wrote a couple Substack posts about U.S. Senate candidate Michelle Tafoya's position on abortion. She is, I wouldn't say just mildly pro-choice. She is someone who has said that, done interviews and talked about how she said, I'd go to Washington in March if they ever took a woman's right to choose away. Now, they did at the federal level. They lost that federal protection. It's reverted back to the states. But the challenge, I think, is how candidates message on this. And one of my Substack posts was about empathy and how you talk about it. And to me, as much as, again, I'm a dude, I'm a guy, so my politics about it is convenient for me because I don't have to deal with it personally on me, my body. But if I was trying to have a thoughtful discussion about it, I would approach it from the empathy standpoint, even while acknowledging that from a polling perspective, it is beneficial for Republicans to have, I think, a more modern approach to the issue. I don't know that I would lead with just the numbers. And so if Republicans are going to have this debate about abortion and softening their positions on it, they absolutely, I think, need to approach it from the empathy perspective, even though part of the reason of having that conversation is electoral and it's a math-based conversation in terms of winning elections. They should approach it from empathy, not from just dry numbers. My take.
And I think that's absolutely true. I think that this, obviously for women in particular, but for everyone, I think is something that is a real thing. Women, obviously, are the ones that carry a child and have to make the decision of whether they are going to carry that child to term and birth or have a C-section or however, have that child, and whether they keep it or give it up for adoption and what that looks like. And I don't think that everybody who puts themselves in the pro-life bucket maybe explore all the reasons beyond. Obviously, I think rape and incest are in their own bucket. I think that is also a bucket, and I'm just gonna speak for some friends or people I know, and conversations I have with women my age, some who want to be mothers, some who do not, some who maybe found themselves accidentally pregnant in college, or shortly after, and having a child would have impacted their lives in ways of restricting, their growth potential and their future jobs and their hopes and dreams. And again, I obviously, I think we talk a lot about safe, legal, and rare. And would hope that women would have access to the birth control that they need to prevent any unwanted pregnancies. But I think that let's be frank, shit happens. And I think it's easy for some folks wearing the pro-life hat. I think sometimes they just don't have the conversations with folks who have made the decision that they've made or want the opportunity to make a decision that is going to be best for their life, for their family, for their future. And just look at it. I understand. I have a lot of pro-life friends as well who look at this as it is a child at conception, at the heartbeat, whatever stance it is. And I'm empathetic to that stance as well. But as a woman, I think that I want my friends to have the best life possible that they decide to have. Again, whether that's they choose to be moms or not, whether they choose to go all in for their career until they're 35 and then have children and don't want anything that was going to derail that. I think that choice should be a choice and not a demand. I don't think that women going through a miscarriage should have to travel to other states to not be charged or to safely be able to have that miscarried child removed. I mean, there are so many different things that we have seen come out over the years that are really sad and horrifying of what women have had to endure in our country because of some states implementing really restrictive laws. I think that finding a way to talk to folks, I think I looked at a lot of different comments in this article has a lot of different things. Chris Maddle, who is unfortunately not running for governor anymore, had some messaging on this that I think was great. He said, Minnesota Republicans keep saying they want a big tent, but aren't following through on their actions. And I think that is anybody that you're saying you have this one stance, you don't belong here anymore, is just not a way to be a big tent to win elections. And then again, he also said that he cannot support leading or being a part of an administration that provides my daughters with less rights than their mom or my mom. And I think I have sons. This is not something that my sons are going to have to be pregnant themselves or have, but they might get married or have girlfriends and wives if they choose to do that. And to say that their future would be more restrictive in the freest country in the world than mine or my parents, it is just a big world salad to say Republicans need to figure it out, because this is a real reality for people in our state, for women in our state, for families in our state, for couples in our state. And it is decisions that people are having to make, and also just not wanting to have to make, even to be restrictive of what their future is going to look like. Big world salad. It is something that we need to figure out.
I would agree.
Yeah, simply put, but
no, very, very well said and very well spoken. I question whether Minnesota Republicans are actually recalibrating their position on abortion. Because again, let me bring this up to you. I'm not aware that there is no, to really get in the weeds for a second, there's a number of things Republicans are going to do this year at the state convention. They're going to endorse candidates, and they're going to look at the platform. They're going to debate resolutions. I'm not aware that any candidate or campaign is doing anything proactively to change the party platform or the party stance on abortion. So none of the candidates that are running, independent of their personal positions or their campaign positions, I'm not aware that there's anything inside the party apparatus that's being organized right now to change where the party's position is on abortion. And so the headline of the story is Minnesota Republicans are recalibrating on abortion after past election losses. I'm not aware that there's any movement inside the party to change anything officially. Now, the candidates themselves might be softening a bit. But again, as the article begins, it begins with a story about how Kendall Qualls had to go up to the stage in 2022 to make it clear that he wasn't picking someone who was pro-choice. Again, there's a difference between candidates' positions evolving versus the party changing where they are. One of the things that's happening this election cycle is we have all these candidates running for statewide office, particularly governor and US Senate, but not all of them are abiding by the party's endorsement process. And so I think it may be a little easier for some of these candidates to float on some of these things, but I think it's going to be a challenge. I don't think, because I think where the opportunity is, and I think ultimately I think the responsibility is for a candidate to lead on this. And I don't think they can. I don't think the party allows that type of space. This is one of many issues where the Republican Party has, in particularly Minnesota, has a great team of cops who like to police other people and say, if you're not with me on this issue, you're not with me on this issue, you're gone. And abortion is one of them. And so, absent, I think, someone coming in and taking on that fight and making a substantive change, I think the party language stays the way it is, because I don't think that the Republican Party, particularly the activists that show up to the state convention and others, are interested in softening their stance on abortion. And that's independent of what some of these candidates do.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing that was a little bit misstep of this article, because I agree with you. I think that they're recalibrating their messaging on it, which is, I mean, I guess a start, because we've talked a lot about how Republicans in general need to understand that talking to delegates at a BPOU meeting is different than talking to voters at the door or on a debate stage or in any other way. And so they need to be aware of that messaging. I would hope that we do make actual changes to our platform at some point to not be an absolutism. I don't have a ton of faith in the delegates for doing that. Also, because I know that there's all sorts of, what the bylaws say of how it needs to come from different BPOUs within different Senate or congressional districts and stuff to actually make it move. I'm not super optimistic that's happening until to be perfectly honest, until there is maybe a generational shift in who the majority of those delegates are and how they stand, because I do think that in addition to this issue, obviously trending a little bit more of where women stand versus men in both parties, I also think there's a generational difference in what maybe a 55 plus delegate views, or even just voter in general views on this issue, versus a 25 to 40-year-old voter. And so, to be perfectly honest, I think until we get to that shift, I don't see the Minnesota Republican Party platform changing that much, unless we go back to what I've been pleading for all along, is kind of a delete all amendment and just go very simple and broad in all issues that are in our party platform versus a long document. But that's an argument for another day. I do think that shifting messaging, shifting to some empathy. Damith has, as she talked about, being a single mom who understands how hard it is to be facing a really hard situation alone, a single mom at a time. There's some conversations about, if elected, you have more opportunity to educate, to potentially put more money into some resource centers, and something that Democrats have criticized Republicans for a while, that being pro-life only means pro-life while in utero, and then doesn't necessarily always provide the services necessary to support folks who do go through with a birth and have a child and get the resources that they need to potentially help them and their child later on. Obviously, we've talked a lot about childcare and the cost of that, and so there's just all sorts of different things here. But I'm with you. It sounds like there is some messaging evolution here, less policy evolution here. I think it is something that we do know some voters are single issue voters of pro-choice and pro-life on that issue. It is going to be interesting to see how Tafoya navigates it. She did not provide comment to the Star Tribune for this, where a number of folks did, like Lindell, who was asked by the Star Tribune in December if he would try to ban abortion. I don't know. I'm not there yet on that. Would I like to? Yes, absolutely, 100%. So
There's the ad.
There's the ad. And because I like the numbers, even though we don't want them to talk about the numbers, I always want to look at the numbers here. And I think numbers talk here a little bit. 26% of Minnesotans, this is according to the last issue poll I could find, May 2024, on this. 26% of Minnesotans say abortion should be legal in all cases, 41% in most cases, 24% say illegal in most cases, 6% say always illegal. So that's, 67% legal in most or all versus 30 illegal in most or all. And then I think that there was also this KSTP survey, USA, which talked more about the abortion until birth with no restrictions. 51% oppose that. And this again is May 2024. And I think it's a good point that you can be for abortion, but not for abortion up to birth, or abortion up to the 9th month, or abortion with no restrictions. That is certainly not what I view my pro-choice opinions on, and I think a lot of folks are the same. And then again, just real quick, pro-choice identity, again, is 61% women versus 41% men. There's a gender gap. I think that is a big thing as well, especially when we're talking about where Republicans can or need to make inroads is among women, and that is something that certainly needs to be in play.
Correct. I think the challenge is for a Republican candidate where the party platform is.
Absolutely, because you're either for or against it, and especially if you're going for that endorsement.
Yes, and the party platform calls for protection of life from conception to national death and supports constitutional amendments to support that standard. And so the party platform, and that's the lens through which many of these activists will do it. And so
Absolutely.
That's where I think the challenge becomes is if you really, and again, not to poke the reporters too much for that article, but I have my doubts as to whether Republicans are recalibrating it. I think that there are Republicans who have a little bit of a softening position, but this has been a problem since the removal of Roe v. Wade. It's an issue that is going to continue to chase Republicans. And I think Republicans, particularly in this state, where we do the podcast, have to focus on, do their positions reflect where voters are? And if they aren't, that's fine, but recognize it's going to be, you're a debating society then. You're not really a political party.
And can we just discuss that we're almost 4 years removed from the Dobbs decision, and still Republicans still struggle to have a cohesive messaging on this?
Correct. And that was, just to go over it for just a minute or two, just one of the points I was trying to make with my Substack post about Tafoya, where I was discussing, abortion. If I think that Republicans, it's clear from this article, if you look at the extremes of Lindell to Tafoya not commenting, that Republicans are not unified on a message on abortion. And I think Democrats are in a much stronger position to message on it because they support what we have right now. And in the contrast, going back to Maddel's point, when you contrast what we have now with taking things away, it's very easy to message in opposition to that and say you're taking away rights. That's the hurdle that Republicans are in. And so I think the challenge is, if this election cycle is about abortion, I think Republicans have a very, very tough time because they're still not there. And I said, that's kind of one of the points I'm making about Tafoya's candidacy is I think that she has taken a position very strong in being pro-choice, almost to the activist side. And I don't think the rest of the party is there. And I don't think she's being transparent about where she is. So that makes me think where Tafoya is on abortion is going to be one of the top issues that the Democrats are going to want to talk about in the 2026 elections. And that's where I don't think Republicans want to be, because I don't think they're, as you laid out the timeline, they're ready for that discussion.
Well said. Continuing on with our conversations about the Star Tribune, Congressman Angie Craig, U.S. Senate candidate Angie Craig, had an op-ed in the Star Tribune this week. I regret my vote on the Laken Riley Act. A little bit of background for anybody who might not remember. This was a bipartisan bill that widens the crimes for which undocumented immigrants could be detained by ICE and held without bail. This all stemmed from the attack and murder of Laken Riley, who was a young 22-year-old nursing student who was attacked and murdered by an illegal immigrant on a run while running in Georgia, Athens, Georgia, 2024. This individual had been previously arrested a handful of times. Angie Craig was one of the votes on this, and a couple notable lines she has. These past few months only has strengthened my resolve to stand up to Trump's cruel immigration policies. As Operation Metro Surge winds down, I found myself reflecting on the past few years of immigration debate, where we go from here, and my vote for the Laken Riley Act. Goes on to talk about being a nation of immigrant, her core beliefs. And she then says, I never thought the Laken Riley Act was a perfect bill, as it allowed for detention of certain violent as well as nonviolent offenses. The text of the bill did not include the word deportation. I made the difficult decision to vote for it. And then also gives shouts out to other Democrats who voted for it as well. Other leaders who came to the same conclusion, but then says, but as I stood side by side with protesters on the street of Minneapolis and opposite dozens of armed immigration and custom enforcement agents at the Whipple Federal Building after Renee Good's killing, and again after the killing of Alex Preddy, I couldn't help but question whether I made the right call. It is true that the president is not using any laws to carry out these sweeping immigration raids that have terrorized Minnesotans, but it's become clear that supporting this bill that gives ICE new authority in this administration was the wrong decision, and I regret my vote. I think this stems, maybe she truly had a self-awakening, and we've talked about evolution, and good for you. She's been getting hit by the Flanagan campaign on this. They did some polling on this. They've been doing some messaging on this. I think that she's feeling the heat from this, and certainly whether before or after those hits she truly believed that she made a wrong decision and regretted it. She's doing some damage control here.
Yeah, I mean, she's in the context of this op-ed is two things. Number one, Congresswoman Craig is running for the United States Senate. Her chief rival on the Democratic side is Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan, who's taken a very progressive position, much more liberal position on a lot of issues. And Congresswoman Craig has always been much more of a centrist, much more of a, I think, in the middle. And so she had taken some of these positions, and she's dialing that back. I think you're right, the context of it. I also think because of what happened in Minnesota, that's the thing here, where I understand there's a Senate race going on, but I think in the context of things, what we've seen unfold in Minnesota, there is an argument that's going to be had about ICE. And did they step too far in this state? They are a government aid agency that is in desperate need of reform and oversight and restructuring. And so I understand it. I have my doubts. As much as I know it's the Senate race, had we not had the ICE rollout and activity in this state, I don't know if she would have had to do this, but she did. And so I think this is now, I mean, in the Senate race, immigration is going to be a top issue. It was already going to be a top issue. And so this is going to be, we're not going to see the end of this. If Craig is the opponent if she's the nominee of the Democratic side, this is going to be discussed. As there's a lot of pros and cons on each side. There's a lot of issues with Flanagan's that are going to be discussed. But she has put this vote front and center in the Senate race. And if she's a nominee, it's going to get discussed with the voters of Minnesota, who are going to decide what's going to happen here.
And I think I completely agree, because I think that on this, I don't think it's inappropriate to question, should ICE have more authority than they did 4 years ago? I would argue no, and I'm obviously not a Democrat who voted for that to move forward until they figure their own stuff out and do some accountability and have some transparency around all that, similar to fraud, like we've had that argument before. I agree. I think that this is a reasonable step back. I don't know that it's going to change how Flanagan attacks her on that. It's kind of one of those things that this was Flanagan got out in front and her team and started defining Craig on this before Craig did. And so we'll see what the ultimate outcome comes from this. They're going through their endorsement process. Flanagan just ran out a bunch of more endorsements she's had from local officials, former representative legislators, and the like. And then just one related, but not on this exact topic. When I was watching that hearing on Capitol Hill earlier, some Democrats obviously shifting conversations about ICE. There was one, and I don't remember who it was. I believe it was a Democrat congressman who brought up Flanagan to Walz and brought up are you guys joined in this? Did you run as a ticket? How does it work in Minnesota? So if people are saying that you are to blame for this, people are likely thinking that Flanagan should be questioned and what she knew and what she was involved in. I don't know if that person has a good relationship with Angie Craig, but I don't think it's a far reach to think that some conversations may have been had between Congresswoman Angie Craig and her colleagues and friends on Capitol Hill, and getting Lieutenant Governor Flanagan's name in the record and questioned a little bit in that hearing. So I'm hopeful Minnesota Press does a little bit more digging and research on that than I did, but it did stand out to me.
No, that's a great catch on your part. And again, there's pluses and minuses with candidates. All candidates have, as I said, pluses and minuses. And the issue will be how, and I know that there were a number of Republicans cheering when this op-ed came out because it moved Congresswoman Craig more to the left. The question is, where are the resources going to be to message on this? Because aside from the national discussion and what's happening in this state nationally, which will frame a lot of the discussion, candidates and campaigns find ways to message too. And so if Republicans are going to message against Craig, and they're going to need resources, funding in which to do so. And this is all going to be a part of it. And so I think it's fair to say that on this podcast, we've discussed much more of the Republican side. But boy, that Senate battle right now, it's really getting spicy. And I'd missed that poke in the congressional hearing today, but that's a great catch on your part.
Also, for Republicans applauding this, what sliver of voters sees her backpedaling on this? What independent or swing voters do you think reads this and is like, oh, I'm going to vote Republican? I would argue that, I mean, if you look at the Venn diagram, that most independent or swing voters probably are on the side. There's not a whole lot of overlap between
That's a good point.
independent swing voters and wanting more authority to ICE.
So you're saying the target audience of people who were supporting Angie Craig just because she voted for the Laken Riley Act, that's not a huge number of what you're saying.
Yeah.
That's a great point.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a great point. Becky, great episode. Before we close, we want to just take a second here to acknowledge that there is a rapidly developing military conflict involving Iran. We didn't have a podcast last week, and so we wanted to catch up on a number of issues. Becky, you and I are going to discuss that much more next week, discuss that situation and break that down. I think we want to take a moment, though, to acknowledge that there's been some loss of life. Among them, Sergeant First Class Nicole Amore of White Bear Lake was killed in a drone strike at a U.S. facility in Kuwait. And so my thoughts and prayers are with her family and their loss. And obviously, this is a very, very serious subject, loss of life. And we are going to discuss it more next week on the podcast and break that down. But we want to just take a moment in closing to acknowledge we didn't have a podcast last week, and we wanted to get into some of these issues. But what's going on in Iran is something that we certainly want to get into, and we will talk about it more next week. Becky.
Thank you for that. I think it's a really important thing to break down and be able to give a good amount of time and conversation to. I join you with my thoughts and well wishes and condolences to those who knew her and loved her. And I look forward to additional conversation next week.
39 years old, served in the U.S. Army Reserve, White Bear Lake, Minnesota. Thank you for your service. We want to thank you for listening to this episode of The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky. Before you go, show some love for your favorite podcast by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or on the platform where you listen. You can also follow us on our website or across all social media platforms at @BBBreakPod. The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky will be back next week. God bless America.
Bye.